Well, we now have a good approximately 15 minutes to take some observations, questions, reactions from the audience. I'm sure we have mics circulating and lots of eager commentators already. So let's, Eric, can I make you in charge of the microphone? And that gives you great power of selection.
Thank you very much.
And can I ask you to please identify yourself and tell us where you're from?
Solomon Asfal, FAO based in Rome. Thanks very much for the presentation. I've kind of a few quick observations. Rafael, maybe would the classification of drylands would change if you change the definitions of the dryland? How sensitive is that to how you define what dryland is not? And another observation is in terms of the technologies that you are promoting. You talked about climate-smart agriculture and so forth. Often it is true that the profits are very high, that's true, but the profit often come at later stage and farmers don't have incentive to adopt or they disadopt. And what kind of incentive structure do you guys imagine so that there's some sort of sustainability in terms of adoption? Thank you.
Okay, questions of definition and then adoption. Okay, let's alternate. There's a hand up right there.
Yeah, my name is Regina Birner from the University of Hohenheim in Germany. Thanks for very interesting presentations. I have two questions. You mentioned as one of the strategies irrigation and also rain-fed agriculture, but I think you avoided a very crucial question, and that is the conversion of pasture land into cropland. Yeah, to what extent is that part of the strategy? It is actually already happening, often under large-scale investment, often also not very sustainable. The World Bank has argued in their publication Awakening the Sleeping Giant that even several hundred millions of hectares could actually be converted. There are serious concerns about the environmental effects of that. So is that issue actually being addressed in your report? And related to that, there is also the question of payment for environmental services like carbon sequestration and tourism, very important in some part of the drylands. Is that actually also considered as one of the strategies for resilience? Thank you.
Can we take one at the very back now?
Thank you. I'm Jan Bukan, advisor on climate change and agriculture at the African United Commission. My question is to the first speaker. What I have heard or picked up from the presentation is that growth is important to improve or enhance resilience. Growth is not bad, it's good. But if we actually look into the historical trends in Africa, particularly during the last 2 decades, there have been growth. Of course, there have been growth, there has been sustained growth, but the number of vulnerable people is actually increasing. This implies that growth per se will not actually lead to improving the resilience of the vulnerable. Therefore, whenever I hear that growth is important, I should actually dare to listen that there is a need in economic transformation as well, where our policies actually need to be inclusive so that the most vulnerable be actually the beneficiaries of growth. If not, growth by itself will not guarantee building resilience. Thank you.
One more. I suggest we go to the middle of the room, then return to the panel for some reactions, and then take another round.
Thank you very much. Charlotte Dufour from FAO Nutrition Division.
I'm sorry.
Charlotte Dufour from FAO Nutrition Division. Actually, my question is a little bit related to the previous one. Has the study looked in any way at the urban dimension? Because a lot of the emphasis on economic transformation is people finding livelihoods, opportunities elsewhere, and cities are likely to be a major aspect of that. What are potential impacts on the cities, and is there any work on policy recommendations for urban planning and feeding those populations in the cities? And just congratulations for illustrating how resilience is about multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder work. Thank you.
Okay, the question is, what are the implications of resilience for urban development and for the food security issues in urban areas? Now, I think that's probably as much as we can digest and take some reactions to that, and then we'll turn to the audience again. So, Raffaello, could we start at your side and then just go to...
Yeah, okay. I'll respond to a few of them. I think some of the questions were more directed towards the second part of the presentation, so Mohammed will probably react to that. On the definition, clearly, as you would expect, there is no kind of clear-cut solution to definitions. As I mentioned, we use the aridity index definition, which is more or less accepted also within the context, for instance, of the desertification convention. And so we also looked, I'm happy to discuss offline, we also looked at alternatives like the length of growing period and so on. Just to give you a sense, essentially we draw the line where the aridity index exceeds 0.65, if you want me to get into the technical aspects. The other one, I think there were two questions that perhaps I can react to. One on the conversion of pasture into farmland. I think what I tried to show you earlier would suggest that this issue will need to be looked at very carefully because if you look at the additional pressure that might be coming into kind of pastoral areas, probably not the last thing, but one thing they really want to do very carefully is to further restrict access by enclosing land for other uses. So I think it can be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but with a kind of a holistic view of what happens to the pastoral livelihoods that rely on mobility to kind of support themselves. The short answer, this has to be looked at very carefully, I think you would imply. On the payment for environmental services, yes, the model that we are developing enables us to kind of estimate the potential of different kind of interventions to kind of have different implications for let's say greenhouse gas emission from livestock. In fact, this was the reason why the regional model was developed, is basically to do that. My personal sense is that it might be it's not going to be the solution to the whole thing. It might be, in certain cases, a possible nice additional kind of part of a comprehensive strategy, not necessarily the response to the whole thing. And the one final response that I can provide, the urban dimension, we don't really have a background paper to that, but I would say that hopefully this kind of overall modeling that we're trying to do will give a sense of the potential for kind of absorbing the additional population growth that might not be possible to absorb in situ through expanded growth in urban areas. But we don't have a specific. It's already like a big scope, as you can imagine. I'll stop here. I think there are a few for Mohammed.
I suggest we turn to Mohammed and then Tesfa and Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe on the incentive structure, Salomon's question, I think yes, it is really key. And one issue maybe to consider is for livestock, for example, that the tension between pastoralism and decentralization, whereby the incentive mechanisms are not aligned to the structures, let's say the institutional structures. So taxation, for example, happens at the end markets, who are regional markets, urban markets, and at the local level, there is no taxation. Where for the farmers, for example, there is taxation at the local level and so on. So I think, and that has a bearing on the way you govern your natural resources, mobility, and so on. So there is a number of issues there. I'm not sure that the paper will be able to address all of them, but at least I think we will identify some of those issues and would come up with an agenda for more work later on. On the colleague from IFPRI, Ms. Berner, The governance issue, I think, the conversion from pastoral to irrigation, I think it's a very critical issue. I tried to, say just, there is an issue about the governance of natural resources there, and we all know that it's not only the matter of what we is called land grabbing, it is as well the fragmentation of the pastoral land and the limits to mobility and constraints to mobility that it introduces, and it's quite important. I know you are all aware of the work that has been done under the CFS umbrella on the voluntary guidelines for governance of natural resources, and there is, I think it is not that, there is now something that we can build on, we can work with as an approach on how to go about these things and how to maybe maximize the benefits for all the group. Absolutely agree on the inclusive policies. I think we try to address it here through, the safety nets and the social security issues. Investments. So maybe if there is a need, we need to do more on that, or maybe to change a bit the wording so that this idea of inclusive policies is really considered, and fully agree with the, it's not because there is growth that the vulnerable people do not exist anymore. Growth can even generate more vulnerability for some groups. Thank you.
Tesfaye, did you have any remarks that you wanted to add at this point?
Just very general one. Thank you. Indeed, there are always trade-offs in complex change like what we are doing now. Times have changed, and then this is we have to kind of find a middle ground between academic perspectives, policy and political perspectives, and we have to listen to the voice of the actual pastoralists, people in the dryland. We have to bring their voice into the perspective, listen to the policymakers, listen to the academicians. IGAD's role is to bring these actors through the platform that it is coordinating, and we need this kind of policy evidence. Had it not been for this attempt, today maybe we may not have something tangible to discuss about. So, through this kind of research and revisiting the past development agenda and so on, once we have evidence from all sources through participatory approach that has been recommended, we can really bring the views together and find a middle ground, and we can introduce innovative approaches that can help the livelihoods. Support the livelihoods of the pastoral people, and we have to be aware that there are some who became better off because of this approach, because there are different voices. We need to bring on board all these, and one of the role of IGAD is policy harmonization, but then we need evidence to do that job well. Thank you.
And Stephen?
Thanks, Karen. Most of my colleagues have answered most of these questions, but maybe I can illustrate further some of their answers with examples from our investment operations. Payments for environmental services. Under our Ethiopia Sustainable Land Management Project, we'll be financing soil carbon and biomass carbon as a way to improve income streams for smallholder farmers. As Rafaela said, it can't be the entire solution. Most of the benefit comes from the improved organic matter in the soil rather than the carbon in the soil for any kind of carbon payment, if it comes. So it's definitely not the solution to everything. Conversion of pasture to cropland, but I'd like to add to that also conversion of forest to agricultural land. This is something we're working on in Ethiopia in a number of projects, and it highlights the importance of a participatory management of the land resources and the forest resources, the water resources, and empowering the communities to carry out land use planning and improve their tenure security to resources and to land rights. And also ownership of trees, as was done in Niger. And this brings us to the incentive question, incentives to adopt sustainable land management practices, other improvements and practices. In Niger, this 5 million hectares of regreening that many of you have heard about is partially due to improvements in tree tenure. In Tigray here, there improved tenure security of landholders. In our Sustainable Land Management Project 2, there's improved tenure security as we've been financing land certification for smallholders who are investing in their lands.
The economic incentives are important for the individual technologies, but there's also an educational component and awareness component as well, so that farmers can take a longer-term horizon before profits start coming from some of the technologies that would be introduced. And then lastly, the incentives can be influenced by the quality of the extension support. There's a lot of capacity work to be done on extension, both through government extension, but also private sector extension, and lastly, participatory farmer-to-farmer extension. So this is that last mile is, I guess, the important thing I'd like to highlight, which is my last point.